I stand before you this morning as a man whose prayers have been answered. Many of us, including myself, have been praying for Jamie, and he is back with us today, and we're very grateful about that. I prayed for the U.S. to beat Canada in the gold medal match this morning, and that happened. We're praying for Pierre for good results. He and Rachel upgraded to the platinum prayer package here at church, and so I've been praying extra hard for them, and we're confident that God will hear our prayers on that. And I think most importantly, after reading a passage last Sunday that included 666, Russ is back with us, so we're all very grateful for that. This morning we continue our series on the book of Exodus, and we're looking at the events that happened in the wilderness between the Red Sea and in chapter 18, they arrive to meet Moses' father-in-law in chapter 18. But we're standing with Israel on the far bank of the Red Sea, on the shore, after God has delivered them in an astounding way. The first 21 verses of Exodus 15 contain the song that Moses and Miriam lead Israel in as a celebration of what God had done for them. And the song has barely faded. Just moments before, Moses and the people of Israel have lifted their voices in triumphant worship of God on the far shore of the Red Sea. Exodus 15 verse 1, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Israel, on this occasion, they dance, they celebrate. Miriam has taken up the tambourine and led the women in joyful response. It was a high point of Israel's young faith. The moment when everything they had hoped for, everything they had hoped about concerning God, all of that has come through for them. Everything that they have put their faith in has come through for them. It's been confirmed beyond all doubt. The song at the Red Sea in chapter 15 is a beautiful one. It's a faith-affirming one. And then 3 days later, Israel is absolutely ready to riot. This is the rhythm of the wilderness, as we're going to discover in this lesson. Mountain peaks of faith are followed by valleys of complaint. Miraculous provision is followed by fresh anxiety. Moments of profound trust are followed by accusations against God and his servants. And if we're honest, it is a rhythm that we all know too well. The God who parted the sea on Tuesday somehow seems absent when the water runs out on Friday. Exodus 15:22 through the end of chapter 17, it records Israel's first lessons in what we might call the wilderness school. These chapters contain a series of crises, bitter water, no food, no water again, and finally an enemy attack. And each one is designed to teach the newly freed slaves what it means to depend on God. They are lessons about trust, about provision, about the kind of faith that survives when circumstances turn difficult. And they're lessons that we desperately need to learn ourselves, including myself. Moses led Israel away from the Red Sea and into the wilderness of Shur, S-H-U-R. For 3 days, they traveled without finding water. 3 days in the desert heat with 2 million people and countless livestock, all of them growing more desperate with every passing hour. The joy of deliverance was quickly evaporating under the relentless sun beating down upon them. And then they came to a place called Marah. Water, at last. They finally have come to water. But when they tried to drink it, they discovered that it was bitter, undrinkable, useless, a cruel mockery of their thirst. The name Marah means bitter, and the people's response matched the name. The text says in Exodus 15 and verse 24, the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Now, notice how quickly they have turned. 72 hours earlier, they had been singing about God's power and faithfulness, and now they are complaining as if none of that had ever happened. The sea that parted, the army that drowned, the miraculous deliverance, all of it seems to have been forgotten in the face of their immediate discomfort. This is how quickly faith can falter when tested by present circumstances. But notice also what Moses did. It says in verse 25 of chapter 15, he cried to the Lord. While the people complained to Moses, Moses is praying to God. This is the difference between leadership and fellowship, between mature faith and immature faith. The people saw a problem and looked for someone to blame. Moses saw the same problem and looked for God to solve it. God showed Moses a log, and when Moses threw it into the water became sweet. The bitter was transformed. What had been poison now became provision. This is a small picture of what God does throughout Scripture, taking what is cursed and making it a blessing, transforming bitter circumstances into occasions for grace. At Marah, God made a statute and a rule for Israel, and there he tested them. The word tested in this context is very important. God is not trying to destroy them. He was trying to develop them. The test was diagnostic, revealing what was in their hearts, and it was also discipling. It was teaching them to look to God in their need. If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do that which is right in his eyes and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord, your healer. Exodus 15, verse 26. The God who had brought plagues on Egypt would be a healer to Israel if they would listen, if they would obey, and if they would trust. The bitter water of Marah was the first exam in this wilderness school, and it came with a promise attached. After Marah came Elim, 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Now the contrast here is very striking to me. One moment they were desperate for drinkable water, and next they're camped at an oasis with more than enough for everyone. And if you think about it, this is how God often works. The crisis is real, but so is the provision that follows. The wilderness has its Marahs, but it also has its Elims. The numbers are suggestive, in fact. 12 springs, one for each tribe of Israel. 70 palm trees, the traditional number of the elders who would later help Moses govern the people. God's provision was not random. It was precisely fitted to who they were and what they needed. He knew them by name, by tribe, and by structure. And the oasis was prepared before they arrived. We need our own Elims in life. We need seasons of refreshment between the trials. God does not lead his people from crisis to crisis without rest. There are green pastures and still waters, even in the wilderness journey. The shepherd who leads through the valley of the shadow of death also prepares a table and makes his people lie down in peace. Elim reminds us that hardship is not the whole story, that grace punctuates the journey with moments of abundance. If you have recently come through a Marah, look for the Elim that may be just ahead. God knows how much you can bear, and he provides respite along the way. But Elim was a way station, not a destination. The journey continued in the wilderness of Shur. And there, the whole congregation grumbled again. This time, they chose to grumble about God, which is always an interesting strategy. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Exodus 16 and verse 3. This complaint is remarkable for its selective memory. You read this and you're like, meat pots? Bread to the full? This is not how Exodus describes their life in Egypt. They were slaves. They were worked to exhaustion. Their male children were murdered. Their lives were bitter with hard service. But now, with empty stomachs, Egypt seemed like a paradise that they never should have left. You see, hunger, or more precisely, unmet needs, have a way of rewriting history, don't they? Their accusation is also theologically confused. They accuse Moses of bringing them into the wilderness to kill them, but it was God who had brought them out. God who had led them by cloud and fire. It had been God who had parted the Red Sea. And their complaint against Moses was really a complaint against God, and God took it as such, if you look at it in the text. Yet God did not respond with judgment. He responded with provision. Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you. Exodus 16, verse 4. The manna was coming. This was food that had never existed before. It was provision that defied natural explanation. It was daily bread literally falling from the sky. God would feed them, not because they deserved it, but because he was committed to them. The manna was miraculous, but it came with rules. Each person was to gather an omer per day. That was about 2 quarts. It was enough for that day and no more, just enough for one day. They were not to hoard it or stockpile it. They were to trust that God would provide again tomorrow. And those who tried to keep extra found that it bred worms and it stank. Or to borrow the King James, my favorite King James word, stinketh. The manna could not be accumulated. It had to be received fresh each and every day. The exception was the Sabbath. On the 6th day, they were to gather twice as much because no manna would fall on the 7th day. God was teaching them the rhythm of work and rest, the rhythm of provision and trust. 6 days of gathering, 1 day of ceasing or resting. The Sabbath was built into the very structure of their sustenance. Jesus would later draw on this imagery when he taught his disciples to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread," in Matthew 6 and verse 11. The manna was a lesson in daily dependence. We are not meant to secure ourselves against future need through anxious accumulation. We are meant to trust that the God who feeds us today will feed us tomorrow. Each day has enough trouble on its own. Each day also has enough grace on its own. Jesus also identified himself with the manna. "I am the bread of life," he said in John 6, verses 48 through 50. "Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that the one may eat of it and not die." You see, the manna sustained physical life temporarily for Israel, but Jesus sustains spiritual life eternally. The bread from heaven in Exodus pointed forward to the true bread from heaven who would come in the fullness of time. God explained the purpose behind the manna in Exodus 16 and verse 4, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. The manna was another exam in this wilderness school. Would they obey the instructions? Would they trust enough to gather only what they needed? Would they honor the Sabbath? The provision was also a proving ground, revealing whether their hearts were inclined toward God or inclined toward self-reliance. And some failed that test, to be sure. They tried to keep the manna overnight and they found it rotten in the morning. They went out on the Sabbath together and they found nothing. Well, what did you expect? Human nature resists the constraints of trust. And I think that's an important point, so I want to repeat it. Human nature resists the constraints of trust. We want to secure our own future, control our own supply, hedge our own bets against divine unreliability. And so we build larger barns, accumulate larger reserves. We create systems that make God unnecessary. The manna allowed no such independence. It demanded daily faith. It refused to let Israel become self-sufficient. Every morning they had to depend on God all over again. Then the journey continued to Rephidim, and once again there was no water. Once again the people quarreled with Moses, but this time the confrontation was more intense. They say in Exodus 17:3, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" And Moses was alarmed enough to cry out, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." Exodus 17:4. And this was not merely grumbling, this was the edge of violence. The people were testing the Lord, demanding proof of his presence. The place would become known as Massah and Meribah, words that mean testing and quarreling, respectively. These places would become a permanent reminder of what happened there. Exodus 17, verse 7, "Is the Lord among us or not?" they demanded. After everything that they had seen, the plagues, the Passover, the sea, the manna, they still questioned whether God was really with them. This is the danger of faith that depends on constantly renewed proofs. Every fresh difficulty becomes a fresh crisis of belief. If God does not immediately solve the current problem, then perhaps he is not present at all. Past deliverance counts for nothing. Only the present moment matters. This kind of faith is exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. It requires proof. It requires God to perform on demand, which is not faith, but really manipulation. And yet, in his grace, God provided anyway. He told Moses to take the staff, the same staff that he had struck the Nile and parted the sea with, and he told him to strike the rock at Horeb. Water would come out of it for the people to drink, and Moses obeyed. The rock was struck, and the water indeed flowed. The very stone that should have been dry became a fountain of life. The Apostle Paul saw the deep significance of this event. He says in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 4, "They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." The rock that gave water in the wilderness was a picture of Christ, the source of living water for all who thirst. Just as Moses struck the rock and water flowed, so Christ was struck on the cross, and from his side flowed blood and water, the source of our salvation. The wilderness provision pointed to a greater provision that was still to come. And the final crisis in this section came from an unexpected direction. Amalek attacked. While Israel dealt with internal struggles of faith and provision, an external enemy descended upon them without warning. The Amalekites were descendants of Esau. They were a nomadic people who saw the vulnerable Israelite caravan, and they decided that they would be easy prey. And so they struck the rear of the Israelite train, targeting the weak and the stragglers, those least able to defend themselves. Deuteronomy 25:18 would later describe their cowardly tactics, how Amalek attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary and cut off. They cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. The stress in the text is the fact that this was not honorable warfare. It was predatory opportunism. This was Israel's first military engagement as a free people. They had watched God destroy Egypt's army without lifting a sword, and now they would have to fight. Moses instructed Joshua to choose men and go out to battle, while Moses himself would stand on a hill overlooking the battlefield with the staff of God in his hand. And what followed is one of the strangest battle narratives in Scripture. Some of you know it well. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. The outcome of the battle in the valley depended on the posture of the man on the hill. This was visible, tangible evidence that the victory belonged to God, not to Israel's military prowess. The raised hand with the staff was a gesture of dependence, an appeal to heaven, if you will, a visible prayer for divine intervention. But as you expect, and as we remember, Moses grew tired. His arms get really heavy. The man who had confronted Pharaoh and stretched his hand over the sea was still a human being with physical limitations. He could not sustain the posture indefinitely. So Aaron and a man called Hur brought a stone for him to sit on and held up his hands, one on each side, until the sun went down. And with their support, his hands, Moses' hands, remained steady. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek with the sword. This image is rich with meaning. The leader needed support. The intercessor needed helpers. The man of God could not do it alone. Aaron and Hur did not fight in the valley, but their ministry on the hill was equally essential to the victory. The body of God's people functions together, each member contributing what they can, each role indispensable to the whole. The raised hands of Moses also prefigure the outstretched arms of Christ on the cross. There, lifted up between heaven and earth, Jesus won the ultimate victory over the ultimate enemy. His arms remained extended until the battle was complete. It is finished. And just as Moses' posture secured victory for Israel in the valley below, so Christ's sacrifice secures salvation for all who trust in him. After the battle, Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner," Yahweh Nissi. A banner was a rallying point in ancient warfare, the standard around which soldiers gathered and under which they fought. The altar declared that Israel's rallying point was not their own strength, but the Lord himself. He was the banner under which they conquered. He was the source of their victory. The name was a permanent testimony that Israel did not win this battle, God did. And every future generation that heard that name would be reminded where victory truly comes from. When we look back over these chapters, I think that a pattern emerges. Crisis comes, the people complain, Moses intercedes, God provides, and then the cycle repeats. Bitter water, no food, no water again, enemy attack. Each crisis is different, but each follows the same basic trajectory. It is almost comical in its repetition if it were not so painfully familiar to us. How many times must God prove himself before his people will trust him? The answer, it seems, is always, well, just one more time. And that's true for Israel, and it's true for us. The repeated tests were not arbitrary cruelty. God was teaching his people something that they could not learn any other way. He was weaning them off of Egyptian dependence and training them for promised land living. He was exposing the weakness of their faith so that weakness could be addressed. He was demonstrating over and over and over and over again that he could be trusted, that he would provide water when they were thirsty, food when they were hungry, and victory when they were attacked. The wilderness was not a detour from God's plan. It was essential to God's plan. Moses would later tell the next generation, "The Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 and 3. The wilderness taught Israel dependence. It stripped away self-sufficiency. It created situations where only God could help, so that when help came, there would be no confusion about its source. The people who left Egypt thought they needed freedom. What they actually needed was faith, and faith is forged in the furnace of testing. Every follower of God passes through a wilderness season in their life. There are times when resources are low, when the way forward is unclear, when the faith that seems so strong in moments of victory wavers under the pressure of daily difficulty. There are times when we are tempted to grumble, to question God's goodness, to romanticize the past, to wonder whether God is really among us. And if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you know these seasons. You have felt the sand beneath your feet and the sun beating down overhead. You have wondered where the next provision will come from. The wilderness is where we discover what our faith is actually made of. It is easy to trust God when everything is going well. It is harder to trust Him when the water is bitter, the food is gone, and enemies are circling. The wilderness reveals whether our faith is rooted in circumstances or in God Himself. It exposes the difference between fair weather discipleship and the kind of faith that perseveres through the long obedience. Many people follow Jesus when the miracles are flowing, but fewer remain when the path leads through the desert. But the wilderness is also where we experience provision we would never have known otherwise. Israel had never tasted manna before. They had never seen water flow from a rock. They had never watched a battle won by lifted hands. The wilderness gave them experiences of God they could never have had in Egypt or in Canaan. The hard places become the places of deepest encounter. When Jesus was led into the wilderness to be tempted, He faced the same basic tests that Israel faced. He faced hunger, He faced thirst, and He faced loyalty. Satan offered bread. He offered proof of God's protection. He offered an easy path to power. And Jesus responded every time with Scripture, including a direct quote from Israel's wilderness experience. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4, quoting Deuteronomy 8, verse 3. Where Israel failed, Jesus succeeded. He passed the wilderness test perfectly, demonstrating what faithful humanity looks like. These chapters press several truths upon us that we need to absorb. And after this, we'll be done. First of all, these chapters teach us that testing is a part of the journey. We should not be surprised when difficulties come. God leads His people through wilderness seasons deliberately, not accidentally. The trials are not signs of His absence, but instruments of His training. James tells us to count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces patience. James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. The wilderness produces something in us that comfort never could. Second, grumbling is a failure to remember. Israel's complaints consistently ignored what God had already done. They focused entirely on present discomfort and forgot past deliverance. And we fall into the same trap, right? We fall into the exact same trap. When current circumstances are hard, we lose sight of all the ways that God has provided for us in the past. Gratitude is the antidote to grumbling, deliberately recalling God's faithfulness as a bulwark against present fear. Third, God provides, but often daily rather than in advance. The manna could not be stockpiled. The water came when it was needed, not before. We want security through accumulation. I think that's just human nature. We want enough stored up so that we no longer need to depend on anyone. But God, listen carefully to me, God often keeps us in a posture of daily dependence where we must trust Him again each morning. This is not cruelty, it is intimacy. He wants us close, not independently comfortable. Fourth, these chapters teach us that we need each other. Moses could not hold up his arms alone. Aaron and Hur had to help. The body of Christ functions the same way. Some of you are sitting in this room right now, having gone through trials and difficulties only very recently. Whether you are aware of it at every moment or not, your hands were being held up in prayer by your brothers and sisters in this room. When we are weary, others hold us up. And when others are weary, we support them. No one makes it through the wilderness as a solitary individual. We need the church, not as an optional add-on to private faith, but as an essential means of survival. And I got to tell you, the older I get, the more apparent that truth becomes in my life. But fifth and finally, and the lesson will be yours, the Lord is our banner. Victory comes not from our strength, but from His. The battles we face against sin, against temptation, against the spiritual forces of evil, they are won by those who rally under His standard, who fight in His name and who depend on His power rather than on their own. When we try to win by our own strength, we fail. But when we lift our eyes to Him, we prevail. The wilderness was not where Israel wanted to be. They wanted to move quickly from Egypt to Canaan, from slavery to settlement, from bondage to blessing. And instead, they found themselves in a barren land where nothing grew, where water was scarce, where enemies lurked, where every day required fresh trust in a God they were only beginning to know. But the wilderness was exactly what they needed. It was where they needed to be. It was the school that would prepare them for everything that would come next. It was the training ground where slaves learned to live as free people, where grumblers learned to become worshipers, where a disorganized mob learned to become a nation. The lessons were hard, but they were necessary, and we are no different. We too want the quick path from where we are to where we want to be. We resist the detours, the delays, and the difficulties. We question why God does not simply transport us to blessing without the painful process of formation. But God knows what He is doing. The wilderness is not wasted time. It is sacred time. Time when we learn to trust. Time when we discover what we're made of. Time when we encounter God in ways that we never would have otherwise. And if you're in a wilderness season right now, if the water is bitter, if the food is running low, if enemies are pressing in on all sides, I hope that this lesson will help you take heart. God has not abandoned you. He has led you here. He will provide what you need, when you need it, in ways that you cannot predict right now. The manna will come. The rock will yield water, and the battle will be won. Not because you're strong enough, but because He is faithful enough. Just cry out to Him as Moses did. Gather what resources He provides daily. Let others hold up your arms when you grow weary. And remember that the wilderness is not your destination. It is your preparation. The promised land still lies ahead. The journey is long, but the God who brought you out will also bring you in. The Lord is your banner. Rally to Him, trust Him, follow Him through the wilderness, one day at a time, one step at a time, until you reach that place that He has prepared for you. And the journey may be longer than you expected. The lessons may be harder than you wished, but the God who leads you is faithful, and the destination is sure. Maybe you're here this morning and you are not yet a Christian. The Bible simply says that if you're willing to put your faith in Jesus Christ, turn from your sins and be buried with Him in the waters of baptism, you can leave here prepared for the journey ahead. For many more of you, maybe you're here and you are a Christian, and yet you know there are changes you need to make before it's too late. Perhaps you simply have a need to be encouraged by the prayers of your brothers and sisters. But if you have a need to respond publicly this morning for any reason, we hope that you'll come as together we stand and sing this song.